I mainly cover the mainstream styles of retro gaming on my channel, being it beat 'em ups, racing games, and shoot 'em ups. Something I barely touched in the past is horror themed games. And why? Growing up, horror was my favourite style of film, and there wasn't many classics from the 1980s that I hadn't watched as a kid. Did I say kid? Yeah, most kids watched horror films back then, whether or not it was acceptable, or if you didn't watch one, then you likely knew somebody who did, because that kids would often brag about it. I was one of those kids who had heard about the controversial video nasties produced in the 1970s and 1980s and were promptly banned for years before being reclassified and re-released to the public. I was one of those kids that looked at those video nasties like they were the absolute holy grail of horror, and was of course over the moon when the late 90s came and seen the cinema re-releasing The Exorcist again. In fact, I watched it at the Showcase Cinema at the time on its re-release. Shortly after, I enjoyed watching the Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the first time, rather than a neighbour's bad VHS pirate copy that I grew up with. As for those films that weren't banned, Freddy Krueger to date is my horror icon of choice, and have enjoyed the Nightmare on Elm Street films since I was in junior school. Friday the 13th is my next choice, Part 6 Jason Lives being my personal favourite of them all. And let's not forget about all the lesser talked about films such as Reanimator, Bad Taste, Braindead, Shocker, Bad Dreams, and truth be told, An American Werewolf in London was the first horror film that totally spooked me at the time. So yes, I am a horror fan, well, of the best eras of horror anyways. So today we are checking out the horror icons that ended up on home computers and consoles. Terrifying it might be in places due to some of the terrible quality of these games. It might not be Halloween, but horror fans are horror fans regardless of the season. This is The Thing, an absolute masterclass in how to do practical special effects in a film and make them still hold up well after 42 years of its original release. Of course, John Carpenter was behind this film, who brought us Michael Myers and Halloween just 4 years prior to this one releasing. So, Carpenter had proved himself to the world at this point that he was a great filmmaker that not only diversified with genres of film, but also did horror, and did horror really well too. Surprisingly, it wasn't until 2002 that The Thing was actually made into a game, and not just as a game of the original film, but it was actually made as a sequel. The Thing was released on Windows PC, Xbox and PlayStation 2 originally, with a Game Boy Color and Game Boy Advance game intended, but these two portable versions were cancelled. As for the computer and console versions, these were all produced by Konami's and Universal Interactive's collaboration label at the time, known as Black Label Games. Reviewers at the time of the game's initial release were generally favourable, and of course fans of survival horror games such as Resident Evil latched onto it, as well as fans of the film itself. In fact, this game sold so well at the time, there was actually plans of a sequel, but Computer Artworks who developed it went into receivership in 2003. The Thing even had a remaster for current gen consoles last year, which again, it reviewed fairly well despite a couple of bugs still being present. As for the game itself then, we play as Captain Blake, a member of the American Special Forces, and it's our mission to establish what has happened to the research team from the original film. Of course, the game plays in a third-person perspective, and we do get the option to use other Special Forces NPCs to help us take on certain tasks within the game, and we can even use them to take ammo if we need it, and order them to take on tasks for us. You might find yourself wandering around initially feeling a little clueless, but the more exploration we give the game, the more the game opens up and more interesting it becomes, with a fairly gripping storyline too, with some really great cutscenes. And it's also not too shy of showing some gore either. It's a fairly startling game to play in places, although I would recommend playing the remaster which came out last year if you have never played The Thing before. The current gen versions just gives it that little more to make it a nicer experience to play. One of the 1980s biggest horror icons came to a few different systems. The Commodore 64 and IBM PCs had its own version by Monarch Software, releasing in 1989, which were both the same game and largely based around Dream Warriors, which released in 1987, or at least had all the main mental hospital characters from that film in that game. But moving away from Monarch computer versions, which were average games at best, we have the Nintendo Entertainment System's 1990 version by LJN. Now, as I played through this, I had at the back of my mind that this was going to be a terrible game. Sure, we don't get to play as any of the iconic characters from the films, and at this point the Dream Child had released in 1989, so 5 films each with characters that could have been implemented where the game wasn't. In this game, we get to play as a teenager, and the aim is to collect all the bones, which kind of reminds me of Nightmare 4 Dream Master when Freddy is dug up in Reborn. Yes, one of the best scenes out of all films, without a doubt. Take a look at the centre of the screen, you'll see how many bones we need to collect. We can enter buildings, which is where the bones can actually be found. We have a meter on the top right hand side. When this drops, our teenager falls asleep and suddenly enemy sprites look a little more sinister and also become more difficult to kill, although we can use special abilities at this point, such as throwing knives. Again, almost like an idea that came straight out of Dream Warriors. After we've collected all the bones, we then take on Freddy Krueger, which is almost like boss fights. I think the fact is that this game is of course an LJN game, and certain YouTubers have pretty much gave LJN games a bad reputation over the years, but I can safely say that Nightmare on Elm Street for the NES really isn't that bad a game at all.
So you're probably asking yourself how a handsome devil like me ended up in a place like this with you, right?
If only Bruce Campbell knew how famous he would be when filming this part of Ash in the original Evil Dead film. The Evil Dead was one of those films that had major censorship issues at the time. The film was edited, removing 49 seconds worth of film in order to gain an X certificate for a cinema release. When this released on video after a cinema run, this was also the cut that fans would have bought at the time. Prior to 1984, home videos didn't actually have a certification system, and so when the Video Recordings Act was passed in Britain, this film was banned right away. And of course, campaigners who campaign against these types of films didn't help when branding The Evil Dead as a video nasty. Strangely, the original 1981 film is still banned to date in certain countries around the world. It wasn't until 1990 that fans seen an actual release of the film on VHS with another 66 seconds cut, as well as the original 49 seconds too. By the year 2000, The Evil Dead finally re-released again as a complete uncut version and was and still is rated as an 18 here in the UK. So yes, The Evil Dead, that extremely low budget B-movie film, began life with a fairly controversial start, but as horror fans will be aware, the franchise is still alive and kicking today here in 2025 with the fairly new release of the awesome Evil Dead Rise. There was a couple of computer film game tie-ins in the 1980s, and of course Evil Dead Hell to the King in 2001 for the Sega Dreamcast, PlayStation as well as Windows. But the Evil Dead game I particularly enjoy above all the games released is A Fistful of Boomstick, which released for the Xbox and PlayStation 2 in 2003. There was also another Evil Dead game for the same platforms in 2005 with Evil Dead Regeneration, but Evil Dead A Fistful of Boomstick has a particular charm about it. The charm is that it partly places a sequel to Army of Darkness and even features Bruce Campbell's voice in the game, and there is plenty of Bruce Campbell cheesy lines too, which will keep you entertained. It's a third-person based hack and slash game where it opens up with Ash talking about his dealings and battles with the Necromonicon Ex Mortis to a random person. As we play the game, we then begin finding out who that person is that Ash is actually talking to and how he ended up where he is. It's a fairly basic game, but it's not about taking itself too seriously. We wander around streets fighting deadites and taking on quests which help us progress further into the game. This is a seriously great game which doesn't get talked about too much. This 1983 release of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the Atari 2600 caused outrage at the time. Sure, this is absolutely nothing by today's standards, but place yourself back in the year of its initial release and consider the 1974 film itself being banned. And 9 years on when this game released, the film itself was considered as a video nasty, as of which most people who hadn't watched it was very aware of it being synonymous with violence and gore. So it's safe to say that many stores refused to promote or even sell this Atari 2600 game at the time, and especially since the aim of the game is to play as Leatherface hunting down victims armed with a chainsaw. The aim of the game is to kill as many victims as possible. Each one is worth 1,000 points. We even get a chainsaw refuel at every 5,000 points, which means we can continue the killing spree. The game ends once we run out of fuel for the chainsaw. We need to avoid wheelchairs, hedges and other bits and pieces, otherwise the chainsaw continues running out of fuel, and we need to of course slaughter more victims for more points. The sound effects here used are of course typical for this system, very rudimentary in sound that is. We often hear high pitched sounds in the game which actually represents the victims screaming. As for the sound of the chainsaw itself, again very typical for the Atari 2600 release. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the 2600 is a fairly basic game and very typical of its time. Now naturally, and given the time of this game's release, you might think that VSS, who developed it for Wizard Video Games to release, might have considered the aim of the game playing as a victim and attempting to escape Leatherface, but nope, the exact opposite. What made this game even more controversial at the time was that it was one of the first ever horror themed games to be released commercially. Is it a good game? Well, it's hard to say. It's certainly a shocking game to play by 1983 standards, and I can only imagine how horrified parents were back then when this was released. If you're enjoying the content today, please like and subscribe, and also remember to hit that notifications bell and select all so you don't miss upcoming content. This channel also has a wealth of emulation tutorials, including standalone and front-end guides. Just Jamie is your ultimate go-to channel for everything retro related. Anyways, for now, on with the video. Domark released Friday the 13th, the computer game for the C64, Amstrad CPC and ZX Spectrum in 1986, and used the very awesome artwork from Friday the 13th Part 4 Final Chapter as its inlay, and it looks stunning with its original clamshell case that it was packaged in at the time. Interestingly enough, when this game released, Friday the 13th Jason Lives was released, and of course this film was the best selling sequel at this point since the original 1980 film. Jason Lives is easily my personal favourite in the Friday the 13th series, including some absolutely spectacular kill scenes and awesome soundtrack, including music from Alice Cooper. But what Domark did was actually took a step backwards and went for the more traditional B-movie style setup of Friday the 13th, and specifically base it randomly around Friday the 13th Part 2, which, like I said, is a little strange since the thing at the time was for publishers taking on a film license and generally to make a new game of a new film. Much like a couple of other horror themed games in this video, particular computer magazines refused to run advertisements on the release of Friday the 13th, the computer game, mainly because of its main artwork. They were very aware, of course, that a vast majority of readers would likely be children, and so didn't want streams of angry letters pouring in from angry parents. The game itself, though, isn't particularly anything special, and what makes it even less special is the absolutely terrible music. It begins with the most generic horror music around and gradually fades into random farmer music. It's all very bizarre, really. We get occasional screams, which to be fair made me jump, as this will randomly indicate that Jason Voorhees is around. The aim of the game itself is to find Jason and prevent him from killing your friends, and this can take quite a long time sometimes as we walk around Camp Crystal Lake hunting him down to kill him. On our travels we can pick up weapons such as axes, chainsaws and pitchforks. Jason will sometimes disguise himself as one of your friends that you were looking out for, and that is the time to attack, but this at times can feel a little confusing. Like I said, the majority of the time you are endlessly walking around different screens, including a church, a barn, and a hut, whilst listening to this absolutely terrible music. It's hard to say this game is any good because it's fairly boring. The computer magazines who did review this game on its original release didn't particularly favour it much either. Zap64 gave it a 13% and your Sinclair ranked it with a low 3 out of 10. Now, what kind of horror games video would this be without mentioning one of horror's classic icons? This is Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. The film released in 1994, a film that my dad bought at the time on its VHS release. And being as such a fan of Hammer horror films from a couple of decades earlier, my dad was totally hyped to watch this film. And although the much older horror films have never really appealed to me too much, I did watch this at the time and thought it was a decent film and a great modernisation of such an old story which actually released originally in 1818. Yes, Frankenstein really is that old. Robert De Niro plays Frankenstein's monster, who does a terrific job, whilst Kenneth Branagh plays Victor Frankenstein himself, as well as directing this film from 1994. There isn't much I could really say about Frankenstein that hasn't been said before. The monster is created by Victor, who then attempts to kill him. The monster then runs away and experiences the cruelty of a world who doesn't accept it or treats it differently because it looks different from other people. The moral of the story, I believe, is don't treat others differently if they look different to you. We had some games releasing for several platforms at the time. This is of course the Sega Mega Drive version. The Super Nintendo also had the same game as this one. A couple of other platforms which had games were very different to this, which includes the Sega Mega CDs game with plenty of FMV cutscenes. Although the Mary Shelley's Frankenstein 16-bit console games are far from perfect, admittedly, I actually have a soft spot for this particular Sony ImageSoft release. I say far from perfect because the controls aren't particularly the greatest. We of course play as the monster and we need to battle our way through several levels using a stick. Although we can actually set fire to the stick, which to be fair doesn't really make a great deal of difference. Enemies still take the same amount of hitting to actually kill off. Hitting soldiers or peasants who are at times shooting at you or throwing random things can be awkward to hit at times. It's much like if you are too close, they harm you, but if you are slightly away from them, you don't have enough length with your stick to hit them. For the first stage, the aim is to navigate around the streets of Bavaria and escape. We do this by finding and pulling hooks which enables platforms to move around so we can make it through. The music is particularly good with this game. Like I say, absolutely far from perfect or not even particularly a groundbreaking game, but I do have a soft spot for this one. Just as you thought the widespread panic and disgust of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre for the Atari 2600 might prevent games of the same style from being produced ever again, a few months later, the same company also released Halloween. The packaging for the game features the original 1979 Halloween artwork, yet the game isn't particularly set around a specific film. When this game released for the Atari 2600, Halloween 3 Season of the Witch had just released. You know, that Halloween film which many argue that it's not really a Halloween film. Anyways, regardless, I think we can safely say that Halloween the game, which was an Atari 2600 exclusive, was solely based around the first two films, if any at all. Just like the Chainsaw Massacre, it's not really surprising then that Halloween also received the same reception from retailers, as well as people complaining about its violent content. I will say again that this was 1983 and this game was something of a rare breed. Whilst other developers were creating harmless arcade games games to make money from, this publisher seems totally hell-bent on creating terror and causing panic amongst worried parents. What made this game even more difficult to sell is that unlike their first Atari release, Halloween had packaging but no label for the cartridge itself. If you do own one with an official sticker, then you were likely sitting on a small fortune. If you bought this game originally in 1983, then there is a good chance that your cartridge has a handwritten sticker stuck to it with the word Halloween and nothing else. Why? Of course, this was for the publisher, which was Wizard, to cut down production costs. It's almost like the publisher was very aware at the time that the sales of Halloween was going to be excruciatingly poor. I mean, really, why didn't they just focus on creating a Pac-Man or Space Invaders clone? Who knows? Both of Wizard's Atari 2600 releases also hold a Video Nasty style status, and I'd imagine that you might have felt like a rebel if you had a copy of either of their games as a kid. So as for the game itself, we play as a random girl. The aim of this game is to look for children and save them by walking with them to a door. As soon as the killer comes on screen, aka Michael Myers, the Halloween themed tune plays, which to be fair actually sounds fairly good. We need to avoid him whilst walking around looking for children to save, otherwise you will find yourself walking to the opposite side of the screen with no head attached and blood squirting out everywhere. Personally, I likely say that Halloween was the better game of both of the Wizard Atari 2600 games. Having said that, they are both also very much of their time where games were fairly basic. The early 2000s saw a resurgence in horror films, specifically horror that aimed to shock people. Many reboots started to emerge, such as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre and the Amityville Horror, but it also seen a fresh batch of new and original horror films releasing too. Personally, I enjoyed Hostel, although there was never a game of it, but we did see a couple of games for Saw release. Saw released in cinemas during 2004, and it marketed itself on brutality and pure sickness, and it worked so much so that new films are still being released today. The original Saw game released in 2009 by Konami for Xbox 360, PlayStation 3 and Windows. There's also a sequel which was titled Saw 2 Flesh and Blood, which released at the same time as Saw 3D, which was back in 2010. Konami also released the sequel too for this. The original game though was my personal favourite game of the two. It is set in between the first and second Saw films. The game plays similar to a survival horror game, although not as technical as some might be in the genre. Of course, the aim of Saw is to survive as we get put into situations where we don't have any choice but to survive. We play the game as former detective known as David Tapp, who the Jigsaw Killer aka John Kramer has recently healed from a gunshot wound. David is then put inside of an abandoned insane asylum which is armed with traps. The reason being is that the Jigsaw Killer is attempting to teach David more appreciation for life. Yes, that old chestnut. When you are in the mind of Kramer, any old reason is sufficient enough to disembowel victims, clearly. We start the game where we need to escape from a head clamp, and this can be a little tricky in unlocking it as we need to press on the correct buttons on the controller as they light up on the clamp. If we don't do it in time, we die. This is when the depth of the game comes into play and the whole third-person perspective reveals itself. As the game progresses, we find out that we have others who are also trapped as victims in the insane asylum. These are people generally who our character has connections with, and so at times we'll also need to save these people as they are set up with puzzling traps themselves. So yeah, Saw generally plays just like you would expect. A very faithful game which feels much like the films. What makes this even more faithful is that the original creators of Saw actually helped Zombie Studios, who developed this game, create fresh new traps which offer brutality. The creators of Saw also had active involvement in the storyline of this game too. The game also contains multiple endings, and so it's not necessarily just a case of finishing it and moving on to another game. This game definitely contains replay value because of the different ending scenes, and of course hardcore Saw fans would invest time in this to play the game differently every time. I would imagine that not many people would have expected to see this game for Nightbreed by Clive Barker, which released in cinemas back in 1990. I wouldn't actually consider Nightbreed to have any iconic characters as such, but it is a Clive Barker film who brought the world of the twisted fantasy horror Hellraiser, and since Hellraiser didn't get a game back then Nightbreed will have to do instead. There was actually a couple of versions of the Nightbreed game, one being simply called the Nightbreed Action Game, which the popular 8-bit computers at the time had a version of, and the other was titled Nightbreed, the interactive movie, which the Commodore Amiga and Atari ST both had a version of. Best of both worlds though if you had one of these 16-bit computers back then, as both of the games were actually released for both. The version I have here is indeed the Action Game. Neither of the games really rated too greatly when they released by Ocean Software in 1990, but just like the film itself, the games roughly have a mixed bag of opinions. You either love them or you hate them. To say Nightbreed was a flop when it released wouldn't be quite right, as it did earn itself around 5 million in profit at the box office at the time, although largely the film released and got forgotten about quickly after. Danny Elfman composed the music for it, and of course Elfman had just made a huge name for his talents from the 1989 Batman film. In comparison to most horror films that the 1980s saw, Nightbreed was an entirely new idea which didn't go for the overdone slasher subgenre which the 1980s see many of. As for the Action Game here then, I won't lie, this is a seriously unfair game in that it's just plain difficult. As we walk around the surface we are beaten up by creatures that we are actually trying to save, which doesn't really make much sense. You'll be constantly shot at, which is very difficult to avoid most of the time, and hit collision detection isn't particularly wonderful here either. We can pick up weapons such as guns, but these are extremely limited with ammo, and so after just a few shots you are back to punching and kicking enemies as we wander around the graveyard with the sound of the church bell ringing. The objective here is to search for a few keys in order to open up Midian, the underground city. It's just extremely difficult to achieve this initial part of the game due to its unforgiving difficulty level. The point of the game is to actually rescue our girlfriend. With a little more work put into this game from Ocean, then this could have been an above average game. I mean, like I said, if you're a hardcore Nightbreed fan, I would imagine this game might be tolerable to an extent. It's certainly an important part of horror film history, and most certainly because of this being a Clive Barker film too. We'll end this video off today with another iconic part of horror history with Bram Stoker's Dracula. Of course not as old as Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, but nevertheless a very old book which was originally published in 1897. I am fairly sure that this even predates the whole vintage category. Many films came and went in history based on the story of Dracula, most notably Hammer Horror's Dracula, which released in 1958 and starred Christopher Lee. Christopher Lee played this character throughout the 1960s and 1970s in many different films, and of course was very well known for his early work of playing the character. Bram Stoker's Dracula, which released in 1992 by Francis Ford Coppola, attempted to give Dracula a new leash of life, and on a fairly modest budget too. It was a huge success, and more than likely Keanu Reeves, Gary Oldman, Winona Ryder and Anthony Hopkins, who starred in it, made this even more attractive for people to watch at the time. A fairly stellar cast, so to speak. And so of course, due to the film's huge popularity at the time, games were made and many platforms had a version of Bram Stoker's Dracula. In fact, 9 different systems had a game, everything ranging from the Sega Game Gear to the Sega Mega CD. The Mega CD game in particular was painful and terrible, to the point that I actually featured it in one of my worst movie game tie-ins videos recently. Generally, most of the games were side-scrolling platformers. Some looked nicer than others, and this Sega Mega Drive version is considered to be the best version in terms of sounds and visuals. Psygnosis, who developed a few different versions including this one, did the game proud in terms of looks. It also reminds me of one of their earlier games too, that's Leander, which released just a couple of years prior to this one. Check it out and you'll see a huge resemblance here. So, for this game we play as Jonathan, and we play through 6 stages, each of which includes a range of different areas, taking on bosses including the Brides of Dracula and Dracula Dracula himself, of course. We can take advanced weapons from Van Helsing in certain parts of the game in order to take on creatures of darkness in a more efficient way. The Dracula games have more or less been slagged off to high heaven over the years, including not so favourable reviews back in the day. And sure, there were some appalling games of the film, but the Mega Drive game is actually a lot of fun, and especially if you love that awesome Psygnosis look and happens to be a fan of Leander. And that's it for today's video. So, which game did you enjoy playing when you was growing up? Do you remember the release for the Commodore 64's version of Friday the 13th? And was you particularly disappointed? Or maybe you was one of those rebel kids who had one of those Atari 2600 games? As always, leave us a comment in the comment section, and if you're new to the channel, please subscribe so you don't miss the next video. Until next time, stay retro.